Thank you so much. Thank you for this introductions and thanks for having me. So what I'm going to talk about today is the legendary physicist John Wheeler and his mysterious student Peter Putnam. So Peter Putnam is virtually unknown, but it turns out that he had quite a fascinating story and that his relationship with Wheeler can shed some light on the intriguing question of the relationship between the observer and the observed, which is another way of saying the relationship between cognitive science and fundamental physics. So I packed a lot in here, but I will try to go quickly and then have time for questions at the end. So the story begins in the American Philosophical Society library in Philadelphia, where I was reading through John Wheeler's journals. That is a few of them. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, Wheeler was one of the great American physicists who did pioneering work in everything from nuclear physics to general relativity to quantum gravity. But his central preoccupation was always the meaning of quantum mechanics, and in particular, the role of the observer. And as he struggled with that problem, he kept journals. These large hardbound notebooks bursting at the seams with letters and cards and notes. He always carried one with him, and he would write down his every thought and conversation. So if he was talking with a colleague, he would take notes in the journal. He would use the journal to plan out his lectures slide by slide. He would then reflect on his lectures after the fact. He would use the journals to run through calculations or just write down his thoughts. He would glue in articles that he found interesting or take notes on books that he was reading. If he made a phone call or wrote a letter, he would record it in the journal. If he had a dinner party, he would draw the seating chart. I'm assuming they had fish. He would try to work out the perfect images to illustrate central ideas that he had. And he would try to find the perfect words to express whatever it was that he was trying to say, often just copying like long lists of words straight out of a thesaurus. So there's just pages and pages in the notebooks just that are lists of words. Sometimes he would just glue in things that made him laugh. But above all, the journals provide just an amazingly intimate look at a brilliant and creative mind at work. Someone struggling rather obsessively to find answers to the mystery of existence, answers to the question, why the quantum, and answers to the relationship between observer and observed. So I was there reading through the journals, this is like nearly a decade ago now, when I came across this page. It was labeled Putnam and My Work. And on one side, Wheeler had drawn his famous little U diagram. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is his idea of a self-excited universe, where the right-hand peak of the letter represents the origin of time and the Big Bang. And then as you swoop down into the left, time is marching forward, cosmic history plays out. And then at the top left-hand peak, an observer is born, and she opens her one giant eye, makes an observation of the past, and then in doing so participates in creating the very universe that created her. Or that was the idea. And on the journal page, Wheeler had written, "Read the little diagram, Putnam says nonsense." So I read that and I was just so curious, like, who dared tell Wheeler his idea was nonsense? Who mattered enough to Wheeler for him to write this whole entry about it in his journal? And at first I thought maybe it was Hilary Putnam, the philosopher, but as I kept reading, I saw Wheeler use this Putnam's first name, Peter. So Peter Putnam, it became clear, was someone that Wheeler cared deeply about. And I realized as I kept reading that Putnam had been one of Wheeler's students at Princeton, which was very strange to me because Wheeler's students, you know, were people like Kip Thorne and Hugh Everett and Richard Feynman. Like, they all became very famous physicists, and yet I had never heard of Peter Putnam. So I was curious to know who he was. So I went home that night, I searched around online. And now if you Google the name Peter Putnam, you will get images of this very large, very orange man in a very tiny Speedo. And as it turns out, this is not the right Peter Putnam. But if you keep Googling, you will come across this man, Peter Putnam, who was at Princeton, who blinded himself when he shot himself in the head in a botched suicide. And thankfully, it turns out this is also not the right Peter Putnam. But if you keep going, you will eventually find this very obscure article in the Princeton Alumni Weekly newsletter called Brilliant Enigma. And this tells the story of the right Peter Putnam, who came to Princeton in 1946 as an undergrad, where Wheeler took him under his wing. Wheeler brought him to Copenhagen to spend time with Niels Bohr. Putnam befriended Einstein in Princeton. So he was in this very rarefied company as a kid, and everyone who met him seemed to think he was really brilliant. Wheeler himself is quoted in the article as saying, "Only 2 or 3 times in my life have I met thinkers with insights so far-reaching, a breadth of vision so great, and a mind so keen as Putnam's." And if you think about who Wheeler was hanging around with, like, you realize that's quite an extraordinary claim. So the article goes on to say that Putnam eventually did his PhD in physics under Wheeler, but then became really interested in cognitive science and in what today we'd call philosophy of mind. And so he went off in that direction. He came up with his own theory of brain function and the nature of the mind. He wrote prodigiously, but rarely published anything. And he ended up living in rural Louisiana, Houma, Louisiana, where he was fighting for civil and gay rights while working as a janitor. And he was living in virtual poverty in 1987 when he got on his bicycle to ride to his job as a janitor, and he was hit by a drunk driver and killed. And upon his death, this now unknown janitor left in his will $40 million to the Nature Conservancy, which it turned out he'd made in the stock market, but he had never touched a penny of it for himself, although he had commissioned and donated tons of modern sculpture, all of it anonymously, which is all over the country, really, in various outdoor and public spaces. And so if you walk around the Princeton campus, for instance, you'll see this amazing collection of modern sculpture. So the one on the left is a Picasso, the one on the right is a Calder, and there's just tons of them. They were all donated anonymously, but they were dedicated to the memory of Putnam's older brother, who was killed in the Second World War. Except for this one. This sculpture is Construction in the Third and Fourth Dimension. It's by Anton Pevsner. And this, I think, particularly striking sculpture stands in the courtyard of Jadwin Hall, right outside of Wheeler's office. And unlike all the others, this one was not dedicated to Putnam's brother. It was dedicated to Niels Bohr. And at first that seemed sort of strange because Bohr was not affiliated with Princeton. Putnam knew him, but wasn't particularly close to him. But what I've realized is that this sculpture was really a gift from Putnam to Wheeler. So Putnam looked up to Wheeler as a mentor and a father figure, but he knew that Wheeler really looked at Bohr that way. Wheeler idolized Bohr. So I think the sculpture was really a gift for Wheeler. And this is a newspaper clipping of Wheeler laying some flowers on it in Bohr's honor. So I think it meant a lot to him. And actually, incidentally, Putnam let Wheeler pick out one of the sculptures. So Putnam, in order to put this collection together, had formed this committee that included people like the head curator of the MoMA in New York and the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art and all these like big shot art experts. But he knew that Wheeler was sort of interested in sculpture. And so in 1968, he sent Wheeler to Hertfordshire, this little hamlet 30 miles north of London, to visit with the great sculptor Henry Moore at his studio and to select a sculpture for the Princeton collection. So here's the one that Wheeler chose. And now Wheeler didn't see anything problematic about this sculpture, like nothing at all. And he was just genuinely surprised when the committee didn't go for it. They ended up choosing this one instead. This is oval with points. And so Wheeler ended up stepping down from the committee and sticking to physics. So, okay, so I'm a science journalist, and I've stumbled across this story of this like unknown genius who was friends with Wheeler and Einstein and Bohr, but ended up as a janitor living in poverty, but sitting on $40 million. Like the whole thing was just this amazing story. But beyond the sensationalism of it, I also just could tell that there was something more to it. And one of the reasons I could tell came from the way that Wheeler spoke about Putnam in the journals. But the other reason I could tell was this. I found this mysterious like photocopy of a title slide that was tucked away in Wheeler's papers for 2 talks given back to back. So the first is by Wheeler, entitled From Reality to Consciousness, and the second by Putnam, From Consciousness to Reality. And so I started to think that maybe somewhere in between the two of them lay a critical insight into this relationship of observer and observed, which is what I was really interested in. And so I decided that I needed to find out, like, first of all, what was Putnam really working on? You know, the Alumni Weekly article said it was this model of the brain and a theory of the mind, but it didn't say what specifically that was. And it said that he had all these papers, but he hadn't actually published anything. So it was like hard to find out what it was. I also needed to know, what did he and Wheeler figure out together about this observer-observed thing that came across in that title slide? And finally, like, why didn't it work? Is it that they couldn't figure something out? Did something else go wrong? Why have we never heard of Peter Putnam? Why did he drop off the face of the earth? And so I've spent the last many years trying to answer these questions. And after a complicated series of events, I tracked down this really lovely man named Coleman Clark, who knew Putnam when he was alive and was one of the few people that seemed to really appreciate what Putnam had done. And so when Putnam died, Clark contacted the lawyer who was in charge of the $40 million estate that was going to the Nature Conservancy. And he said, you know, what's going to happen to all of Putnam's papers? And the answer was just nothing. Like, the stuff was probably just going to be thrown away. And so Clark went on a rescue mission and grabbed all the papers. And he has kept them safe for all these years until I showed up at his door in Rochester, New York, the first person to ever come asking to see any of this stuff. So I had no idea what to expect. Clark told me that he had Putnam's papers in his storage unit, and so he drove me over there. So I'm thinking, like, we're going to his storage unit. It's going to have whatever storage units have, like rusty bikes and unused exercise equipment. And then somewhere under a pile of something, there'd be like a dusty cardboard box and some of Putnam's papers in them. That is not what this was. So Clark rolls open this giant door, and inside is essentially an archive. It's just rows and rows of filing cabinets. They're stuffed to the brink. I wish I had a photo of it, but I don't. And in these filing cabinets, there were endless typed manuscripts. I just could not believe how much Putnam had written. Massive amounts of notes, binders and binders of letters, including countless letters from Wheeler, reams of poetry that Putnam wrote, newspaper clippings, photos, scraps of memorabilia, just everything imaginable. And these are some photos of Putnam that he took in a photo booth. And then apparently he went into the photo booth with his dog and took these. And then there were also journals of the same variety that Wheeler had kept. So Putnam was as crazy a note taker as Wheeler, but he was just less organized and had worse handwriting. But you can see from, for instance, the dates on this journal. This entire journal spans 1 month. So you can imagine how many there were. And basically between the two of them, if Wheeler and Putnam were having a conversation, then Wheeler was taking notes on what Putnam was saying, and Putnam was taking notes on what Wheeler was saying. And now I had both sets of notes and could reconstruct every conversation that they ever had. So over the past several years, I have relived in unholy detail their entire friendship, which did indeed center around this question: what's the relationship between observer and observed? Okay, so what is the relationship? Well, Wheeler felt strongly that the observer plays a crucial role in quantum theory. And this is a figure that Wheeler drew And along with it, he wrote the following. The quantum principle has demolished the view we once had that the universe sits safely out there, that we can observe what goes on in it from behind a 1-foot thick slab of plate glass without ourselves being involved in what goes on. We've learned that to observe even so minuscule an object as an electron, we have to shatter that slab of glass. We have to cross out the old word observer and replace it with the new word participator. In some strange sense, the quantum principle tells us we're dealing with a participatory universe. So why is it a participatory universe? Why, if we talk about an object in the world, do we also have to talk about the subject? So I think Bohr put it very nicely, or at least succinctly, when he said, the finite magnitude of the quantum of action prevents altogether a sharp distinction being made between a phenomenon and the agency by which it's observed. So the non-zero value of Planck's constant, the quantum of action, prevents us from being able to draw a sharp line between observer and observed. And here's how I like to think about that statement. This is my silly version of Wheeler's U drawing, but instead of the observer looking at the Big Bang, I just wanted him looking at any old object. So in this case, it's a tree. So the guy on the tree sort of seem like separate things, but when they're interacting, we look closely and we see that they're actually conjoined. And so in my reading of Bohr, like Planck's constant, H, literally measures this kind of minimum size of the irreducible overlap between subject and object. And so in the course of an interaction, you're going to have this minimal area of commingling where there's kind of no way to pull subject and object apart, because in that little area of overlap, there's no way to say who's who. And so one way I find it useful to think about this is to say that Planck's constant is a kind of coupling constant between observer and observed. So if you could like turn the strength of the coupling all the way down, like the area would get smaller and smaller. And then if you turned it all the way down to 0, that overlap would be gone. Observer and observed could be neatly separated. You'd recover classical physics and you'd have this objective, observer independent, non-participatory world. But since Planck's constant's not 0, in Wheeler's view, the universe becomes a participatory universe. The observer becomes a participator. Okay. So this brings us to Putnam's theory of the observer. And I don't have time to go into like a ton of detail about what he did, but I just want to give you the gist of what I see as his central insight. So Putnam saw that the mainstream scientific view of the mind, which is called cognitivism, which was the mainstream view back then, it's still the mainstream view today. He believed that it was not compatible with a participatory universe. So what is cognitivism? In a nutshell, this is like the view we probably all just naturally have of what a mind is. It's the view that we take in information through our senses, we output behavior with our actions, but cognition is the thing that happens in the middle, like in between our ears. So our perceptions result in internal representations of the external world. Our experiences are experiences of those representations, not of the world directly. And in that sense, that the mind, or the sum total of our thoughts, our perceptions, our experiences, that the mind is in the head, that the mind is a kind of function of the brain. And finally, that cognition is considered a form of computation that the brain performs over those representations, which could be instantiated in like neural networks or something. So that's like the very, very nutshell gist of cognitivism. The mind is in the head, and what we experience are representations of the world. And so what Putnam saw about this was that this cognitivist view of the mind is like the observer looking through the plate glass. It's a profoundly passive view. It's a way of thinking about thinking that comes to us from Descartes. So Descartes said the mind takes on impressions of the world like wax takes on the impression of a seal. And most like cognitivists today would deny that they support any kind of Cartesian dualism, you know, where mind and matter are treated as two separate things. But this kind of dualism is really still in there because it's in the dualisms of subject and object, observer, observed, internal, external, private, public, mind, world. And all these dualisms are there precisely because this view requires this kind of like neat separation of subject and object that this finite magnitude of Planck's constant forbids. So, okay, this is my cartoon picture of cognitivism. And this is just to show, if the world is delivering information to the senses, that's going into our brains. Our brains are constructing this sort of copy of the world inside of us. Then that's kind of this one-way passive process. And it's like taking on, the impression the way wax takes on the seal. And the internal representation that the observer experiences is in the end just completely decoupled from the object in the world. And that's why we can talk about like brains in vats, or we can worry about Boltzmann brains in cosmology and all these things. So Putnam's insight was that if you can like take away one thing, I hope it's this, that Putnam's insight was that quantum theory requires us to conceive of a world in which cognition is an active participatory process, one that's not mediated by internal representations. And so that's what Putnam set out to do. He wanted to create a model of the brain and a philosophy of mind that replaced the old word observer with the new word participator and avoided this use of internal representations, which end up like decoupling the observer from the world. So that's what he did. He wrote paper after paper after paper after paper, none of which he published. There are many, many more than this. And in these papers, he laid out the details of a whole model in which the brain is not forming internal representations, but it's correlating sensory information with motor behavior. And so in Putnam's model, all of perception is about learning how sensory signals change relative to our bodily movements. And the result of that learning is never like an image in the head or a movie in the head, but a sensory motor coordination. So you end up with a skillful, embodied, adaptive adjustment to the world. So instead of a representation of the world, we just end up with a better grip on the world, or a stronger like bodily resonance with the world. So every adjustment the participator makes changes the world, and then the participator has to adjust to that change. And this goes on in this dynamic process that's always unfinished, but one in which the observer and observed are always in continuous exchange and transformation. They're never decoupled. So the brain's job in Putnam's view is not to represent the world, but to help the body best respond to the world. And what that means is that cognition or thought or mind, or however you want to put it, is not actually constituted by these neural processes in the brain. Like the neural processes in the brain are obviously very important, but what they're doing is facilitating cognition, which itself is constituted by this entire brain, body, environment system and these sensory motor loops that run through them. So I know I'm saying a lot of things, but I'm just trying to give you kind of a gist of where Putnam was coming from and how it came out of this idea of a participatory universe. So just to sum up, for Putnam, consciousness is not something that we have inside of us. It's something we do through our ever-changing grip on the world and through the world's ever-changing grip on us. It's an active participatory notion in which observer and observed always remain profoundly coupled, as quantum theory suggests that they should be. And there's tons of really interesting detail to all this. There's fascinating experimental evidence that supports this view. But what I want to get across here is simply that the participatory quality that Wheeler saw in quantum mechanics, Putnam took and applied to creating this completely new way of thinking about cognitive science. And if you look back at this figure that Wheeler drew, the caption here that he wrote says, quantum mechanics evidences that there's no such thing as a mere observer. The observing equipment participates in the defining of reality, and in that sense, the universe does not sit out there. And now I think with Putnam's theory of the observer, we could add, not only does the universe not sit out there, but neither does the mind sit in here. And so we've sort of found a place for them to meet in the middle where they're coupled, and there's this irreducible area of overlap. So it's really interesting to note, or it's really been really interesting for me to realize, and this is what Chris was alluding to, that there's this growing trend today in cognitive science called it goes by names like 4E cognition, because it has these various theories that all happen to begin with the letter E. So there's embodied cognition, extended cognition, embedded, enactive cognition. Some people also include ecological psychology as another E. And what all of these approaches have in common is a rejection of internal representations, a rejection of this kind of Cartesian spectator view, and an embracing of a sensory motor, active, participatory notion of cognition. And so Putnam was like incredibly ahead of his time. And, you know, personally, I think these 4E kinds of ideas are going to become kind of bigger and bigger, but even though you have all these cognitive scientists today sort of working on this type of a program, nobody had the insight that Putnam did in seeing any kind of connection between this way of thinking about the observer with fundamental physics. And that came from this relationship with Wheeler. So looking back to that first encounter that I had with Putnam in Wheeler's journal, when Wheeler had drawn this diagram and Putnam said it was nonsense, I kept thinking, well, why did he really say it was nonsense? I think he saw that image as a little too passive. And I suspect he thought that it kind of emphasized the gap too much between observer and observed. And so my thinking is that of all the various versions of this diagram that Wheeler tried, I think Putnam would have preferred this one. So here the participator sort of is punching the world or grabbing the world. It's much more embodied and active. And rather than seeing a gap, we see a full loop, which I think was more in line with Putnam's thinking. And I also find it interesting, you know, the hands happen to be labeled X and P. I'm assuming those are position and momentum. And so I think Wheeler is sort of pointing out that we have this choice in what kind of action we take on the world. And it's the fact, and whichever one we take, the other one's sort of left out. So the fact that we have that choice, the fact that those are non-commuting choices, prevents us from being able to give a description of how the world simply is, independent of the actions that we take on it. Okay, so we've answered the question, what was Putnam working on? What did he and Wheeler figure out? Well, Wheeler said quantum mechanics is about replacing observers with participators. Putnam said cognitive science is about replacing observers with participators. So they were obviously on the same page. Why didn't it work out? Like, what happened? And I think a few things happened. I think one is that Wheeler could not understand what the hell Putnam was talking about. Putnam spoke and wrote in what everyone who knew him came to call Putnamese. It was his own kind of language. He used words in very unconventional ways. He went off on strange and often mystical sounding diversions. He was hopeless at explaining his own ideas in ways that would really mean anything to anyone. And I say this having struggled, and I really mean struggled, through his writing for years and years. I would not wish it on my worst enemy. I am thrilled that I now see what was in there, but it was not an easy road. And Wheeler tried valiantly to get at what Putnam was really trying to say, but ultimately he couldn't do it. He knew Putnam was onto something important. He knew it might contain answers that he was looking for, but he just couldn't distill the essence of what Putnam's work was all about, and Putnam couldn't explain it. But there was also a deeper trouble that had to do with what I call the problem of multiple observers. And just to go through it quickly, so we know in quantum mechanics that when an observer makes a measurement, the probabilities, we can calculate the probabilities for the outcomes of the measurement, but the outcome has this kind of element of randomness in it. And so we can ask the question, if I make a measurement, let's say I measure an electron spin along some axis and I find that it's spin up. Is it spin up for everyone or just for me? How do I share the outcome of my measurement with other observers? Why would we all agree? How does an electron with spin up for me become an electron with spin up for everyone? And here's how Wheeler posed the question in his journal. He said, does the one who makes a quantum mechanical measurement act as agent for all the others? And the problem is that the formalism of quantum mechanics doesn't seem to give us any way for that to happen, right? In relativity, by contrast, we have transformations that we can make from one reference frame to another. And so even though we might measure different things, I can measure space that you would measure as time and vice versa, we can still figure out what each other is seeing. And in that sense, we can say there's like an intersubjective shared reality. And that's because relativity gives us this invariant higher dimensional space-time that's the same for everyone. And quantum mechanics doesn't really give us anything like that. And it sort of forbids it. I can't make like a passive transformation that would tell me what you see, right? Because that would imply some kind of hidden variable. And so all I can do is interact with you and ask you what you've seen. But in doing that, I'm making a measurement of you, and the outcome of that measurement, like all measurements, has this kind of fundamental element of randomness. And so I can't really treat the outcome of my measurement of you as revealing a pre-existing fact about what you saw. I can only treat it as evoking a new fact that I've now participated in creating through my interaction with you. And so when you pursue this line of thought, it just becomes very unclear, like how you can really piece together different observers' perspectives into a shared or intersubjective reality. And this troubled Wheeler to no end. He agonized over it in the journals. He would ask questions like, what happens when several observers are working on the same universe? In one journal entry, he writes, is this world a misleading simplification for all our worlds? What these separate worlds are and how they fit together, the central problem. Lots of recognition circuits, not a universal one. That's honesty, and that raises the issue of linkage, how to link. Big buzzing confusion indeed. July 14th, 1975, he writes, on few issues in my life have I ever been more at sea than I am now on the relative weight of the individual and the collectivity in giving meaning to existence. December 17th, 1980, what troubles me more than anything else is how different observers combine their impressions to build up what we call reality. And these are very few examples of him agonizing over this for years and years and years. April 18th, 1980, how are acts of observer participancy fitted together? That's the central mystery. Is there any point partway between all and none on this issue? Each of us a private universe, preposterous. Each of us see the same universe, also preposterous. So that's, Wheeler was just deeply perplexed by this. How do you make a participatory universe into a shared universe? And Wheeler turned to Putnam over and over again to ask this very question. And Putnam never gave him a satisfactory answer, both because he would answer in Putnamese, but also because it was sort of a personality issue. He was this very lonely, distrustful person, and he wasn't bothered by the idea of a kind of solipsistic view. He was, I think, a little more comfortable with that. And this drove Wheeler crazy because Wheeler was someone who cared so deeply about other people, cared about working through ideas with colleagues, with students, and really needed some way of saying that this is a shared world. It was like deeply morally important to him. He wrote in his journal, it says, Putnam's idea that all resides in one consciousness is attractive in that there is where the center of the mystery lies. To communicate with others and to give meaning in the sense that this communication gives meaning is part of the act of consciousness itself on this view. I've been distrustful of it in the past, in part because Putnam's thinking itself has been more ego-centered than colleague-directed in my judgment. But granted the idea is right, this special feature of Putnam's thinking might put him in better tune than others with the truth. This gets us out of the game of looking for a mystique of communication, some way to attribute to it a number, such as Newton attributed to gravitational influence. We focus instead on the I, and that's like the capital letter I, not the I. So Wheeler distrusted Putnam's view because he thought Putnam was too ego-centered, not colleague-directed. And in a sense, that was true. Like Putnam didn't make concessions that would allow other people to understand him. He hid out in Houma, Louisiana. He refused to publish. He was a hermit. But the kind of irony in all of that is that all Putnam wanted in life was for Wheeler to see that he had answers that Wheeler was looking for. And Wheeler's description of Putnam saying all resides in one consciousness is clearly not really what Putnam thought. That has like these strong cognitivist undertones that Putnam couldn't seem to break Wheeler out of, even though he tried. This is one letter that Putnam wrote to Wheeler, where I think he's actually clearer than usual. He says, observation is contrary to the whole philosophy of observer-participant. It's an anachronism from the old pre-quantum world that we hang on to because of grammatical compulsions we don't yet know how to get around. We must replace observation by a participatory category. St. Thomas says we know things in the act, not in their essence. And then he adds, we relate to the world as I, other. So Wheeler had said Putnam's focused just on the I, and Putnam's sort of saying, no, it's never the I alone. It's always this relation. It's I, other. It's the subject-object coupling. And you can't decouple the subject from the object any more than you can decouple the object from the subject. And that, to me, is the start of an answer to Wheeler's question about multiple observers. Because we can ask, like in this kind of embodied and active participatory view that Putnam was espousing, like what happens when two observers interact with each other? And this is a ridiculous image, so sorry about that. But in the old cognitivist view, if you think of two observers interacting with each other, each one's forming an internal mental representation of the other. And so you don't really have a genuine shared interaction. Like each person is interacting with a kind of virtual version of the other person, and it's all happening in each one's head. Neither has any kind of real access to the other's experience. We can kind of infer things about each other's experiences, but those inferences are still in our own heads, and the whole situation is decoupled. And in the participatory view, this is no longer the case. And I apologize for the monstrosity that is this image. Okay, so, but hopefully it makes a point. Something more profound is possible in this view. So I had said earlier, like that in Putnam's model of cognition, the result of a perception, which is really an action we take on the world, it's that punching, is not an image in the head, but a better grip on the world or a stronger bodily resonance with the world. We act on the world to change it, and then we have to adjust to that change in this continuous dynamic coupling in which both parties are sort of transformed in the process and something novel comes into existence. And that's true whether you're talking about an observer measuring an electron or an observer measuring or interacting with another observer. And so here you can think of two observers, each is acting on the other, changing the other, is changed by the other. They're struggling to resonate with each other to get a better grip on the world. And they do all of this through this genuine coupling, through an experience that's not private to each one. It's not locked away in their heads. It's in their embodied interaction. So the experiences are not in them. They together are in one shared experience. And there's an area of overlap in which it's not possible to decouple them or say who's who. So in the interest of getting rid of this image from your minds, I will just put the dogs back up. So how does this address the multiple observer problem? Well, we can't say that there's like a shared reality that's just given. That's what Wheeler saw as the problem. But if we give up the cognitivist view of the mind, as Putnam said we have to do, then we can see that when two participators interact with each other, they participate in a genuinely shared interaction. Neither unveils a pre-existing feature of the other, but they shake each other until they shake up a new bit of world. And that new bit of world belongs to both of them. So the shared world isn't given, but it can be forged. And I love this quote from Chris, where he says, I think the greatest lesson quantum theory holds for us is that when two pieces of the world come together, they give birth. Wheeler and Putnam were two unlikely pieces of world to come together. But in reliving their shared story, I've come to see that this cognitivist view of the mind, much like classical physics, was always about representing a stillborn world, a world that was just sitting there. But the world that we get if we put Wheeler's ideas about the observed together with Putnam's ideas about the observer is a fertile world. It's one that's born and reborn through every interaction. It's a shared world that's not pre-given, but can be created interaction by interaction when minds come together in these embodied active ways and shake each other. So I'll just wrap up with one last image. So before the pandemic, I went to Princeton because I wanted to look at this portrait of Wheeler. So this is the official portrait that hangs in the physics department there. And I find it really moving for two reasons. The first is that of all the ways that you could depict a physicist in a portrait, they chose to show Wheeler writing in one of the journals. And I don't think there's really a more perfect way to show who he was. The second reason I find it moving is because I happen to know that when it was painted, Putnam had already been killed, but it was Putnam who commissioned and paid for this painting. So while Putnam may have been a hermit and he may have been forgotten and he may have not always been very colleague directed, he cared really deeply about Wheeler. And then Wheeler in turn left us clues to Putnam's life tucked away in the pages of those journals. And in piecing together their lives and their interactions with each other, I think we can find novel ideas about the links between observer and observed. So thank you so much for listening.